Thank you all for joining us on this Zoom today. This is the first of a new series that the museum is launching of author talks with about recently published books, and we are thrilled to have Jeff Fuhrer joining us here to talk about the myth that made us, how false beliefs about racism and meritocracy broke our economy, and how to fix it. Um, my name is Naomi Slip. I am Chief Curator and Director of Museum Learning at the Whaling Museum, and really excited to have this conversation with Jeff. I'm going to give an introduction, and then he's going to take us on a sort of walkthrough of the book. And I'll probably turn my camera off so I'm not distracting people here in my office space during that. Then we'll come back together and hopefully have a conversation. I've got some questions, and we can talk through some of the themes of the book and what comes next. Jeff has an extraordinarily impressive career in various financial institutions, currently a non-resident senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution and a foundation fellow for the Eastern Bank Foundation. In 2015, he worked on the Federal Reserve's 2015 Color of Wealth in Boston study. And some of that work, I believe, fed into some of the material that we have in the book here. He recently finished a 2.5-year term as a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, conducting research on the Fed's new monetary policy framework and the sources of the racial and ethnic wealth gap. He previously served as Director of Research, Executive VP, and Senior Policy Advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, has been an Associate Economist at the Federal Open Market Committee, and began his career at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in Washington, D.C. Along with that policymaking work and research, he also served as an associate editor for the American Economic Review, and holds degrees from Princeton University and Harvard. So thank you so much for joining us today, and really looking forward to hearing from you about the book, which I hope people in attendance will purchase a copy and read to dive deeper into what we're going to hear about in just a minute. All right, so I'm going to mute myself and turn off and hand it to you.
Thanks very much, Naomi. It's great to be here with folks from New Bedford, from the Whaling Museum in particular. I have special and longtime friends in John and Kathy Ricketson who have been involved with the museum, and a newer friend in Naomi who just introduced me. And thank you for the introduction. You can see the cover of the book there. If you do choose to buy it, I'd encourage you to support your local bookstore. Always, I'm sorry, but even I think better than Amazon or some other alternative. So your local bookstore can get this or has it in stock already. Um, I do want to talk about the book. I also want to leave ample time for conversation, questions, discussion, because I've heard myself talk before, and you don't want to hear me talk for too long. I really like to hear what people have on their minds about these issues, so we will leave time for that. This book is about how our economy works and doesn't work. It was spurred by an almost, I guess I'd say, a moral compulsion that came out of examining over many decades how the economy works, how it was put together, and importantly, how these narratives were used to shape the economy over and over again, making choices that make our U.S. flavor of capitalism quite different from other capitalist economies around the world. So let me talk about what the narratives are, the suite of narratives that I call the myth. The first and maybe most important is this sort of bootstraps Horatio Alger meme that says individual effort is really all you need to succeed. If you work hard enough, you can succeed. It's often attributed to Horatio Alger. There's an asterisk there because, interestingly, that is not really what Horatio Alger was about. If you read his books, and I have a citation of a forward to his book in my book, it shows that he was much more concerned about building compassion for folks who don't succeed than just telling everybody that you pick yourself up by your bootstraps. So that's just a testament to how much we believe in that narrative, that we impute to Alger motives that really weren't present in his work. He had something else very different in mind, which is much more consonant with the way I think about the world. We need to make sure people have opportunity. There are two corollaries to that narrative that are very important because, of course, if you believe individual work is sufficient to success, then you might look at anyone who hasn't succeeded and say, well, the reason is they haven't worked hard enough, clearly, because that's a sort of a corollary to the narrative. And going with it, and there was a long history to this, and Naomi sent an email with a couple of references, and I have some in the book that that means that because of the way that narratives work, we have built a national distrust or mistrust of the poor. And there's very old literature in the state of Commonwealth of Massachusetts, as well as other documents that show that we have been very good at categorizing the poor as those who are, quote, deserving and those who are, quote, undeserving. And that's an unfortunate characterization. It's just deep in our national DNA. So that's one key part of the narrative. The second is about the role that race plays. This is also false in my belief, but it's not a belief or a casual assessment. It's based on data and history and a careful study of this, that racism somehow no longer is an important determinant of especially economic outcomes. I think that's demonstrably false. I think it's an aspiration. We would like it to be true, but it is not. And if we take it to be true, then we can miscraft policies and policy responses under the assumption that somehow race doesn't matter anymore. The third part is about the third part of the myth is a narrative that says how it is that businesses are supposed to operate in our economy. And this is due not exclusively, but in large part to Milton Friedman, who many of you have heard of. He's deceased, but he won the Nobel Prize in economics for not this work, but for other work and how the economy works on the monetary side. But he wrote an editorial in 1970 that said that businesses were starting to veer into other areas like concern about community and the environment and other things that are not their province. What they should do is maximize shareholder value or profits or their stock prices. These are all roughly equivalent. And that is the only thing. And in fact, he said if they do anything else than that, it's tantamount to socialism. And for him, those were definitely fighting words. So that is that maxim that business really should solely and exclusively maximize profits, in my view, has done tremendous damage to the economy. I'll show you a couple of statistics in a minute that show the damage it's done and also what it's done for profits in the US, which is interesting to juxtapose those two. The fourth important piece of the myth is this fairy tale about how government's supposed to operate. What is its role? And the answer is to let free markets flourish and stay out of the way. The reason I put free markets in quotes is because there's no such thing. What free markets really is about is saying, well, the way markets are currently supported by the government, and they are supported in a host of ways, from direct subsidies and so on to supports that have to do with the infrastructure that the government has to build in order for the economy to function well. So what free markets advocates really mean is please leave all those supports in place. Of course, the infrastructure, the technological, the communications, the transportation, the legal infrastructure, leave that in place because that's doing great for us. And leave the subsidies in place because those who are subsidized benefit mightily. Don't do anything to interfere with those. Well, that's a very different notion of what free markets are about than, the literal definition of free markets. There are no such thing as free markets. However, they are used, I think, often as a blunt instrument. The idea of free markets is used as a blunt instrument to stop important government programs that might actually allow freer access to economic opportunity, more equal access to economic opportunity, which would ironically benefit everyone, including the free market advocates. But those four together are components of the myth that have been used in two important ways over history. And there's way more in the book. I cannot possibly touch on all of it. What I'll just allude to is the two basic ways. One is those narratives are used to dismiss poor outcomes that we observe in our economy. It's very difficult to deny the existence of the poor outcomes, that they dismiss them because they say, one, those folks who are not doing well, it's on them. It's not institutions, lack of opportunity, structures, institutional racism. It's none of that. Is they are responsible for their own fortunes. They are clearly not working hard enough, have made poor decisions, and so on. And second, in terms of dismissing poor outcomes. This is just the way a well-functioning capitalist economy works. There are winners and there are losers. Aren't we lucky to be the winners? Now, aren't we virtuous, really, to be the winners? And those other folks are not going to win because they don't know how to function in this highly efficient free market capitalist society. Well, that's bad enough. But even more importantly, those same set of narratives have been used to consistently perpetuate a system that delivers these outcomes. The book gives a host of historical and economic um, examples, explicit historical record that shows the ways in which the narratives are used to continually choose a system that provides what I view as meager assistance to the poor, what I think is easily demonstrable as unequal access to economic opportunity, while at the same time making sure that we slant all kinds of benefits, riches, and political power to the few. And it's for that reason that the system is self-perpetuating because it does so well for the economically and politically powerful that they're able to sustain that system and keep slanting it in that direction so that they continue to reap disproportionate fraction of the economic rewards. Well, that's a quick description of how the system works. There's much, much more to talk about. We can talk about that in a moment. I want to show you three slides quickly that show what that system has delivered for the people in our country. So these are three slides that show three measures of economic need. And the bottom line here is that need is great across lots of demographic categories. It is disproportionately, need is disproportionately skewed towards people of color, for sure. But in fact, so this table, which will show you how many people fall below the poverty line, the answer is loads, and it is true for white non-Hispanics, for blacks, of course, and for others. There are lots of folks in the country who experience poverty. Now, I put the poverty rate first because it's actually the narrowest definition of economic need that I address. Most people don't know what the poverty rate really means and who it covers. So, very quickly, what the poverty rate means is the US government defines for all geographic locations in the United States an income level. And if you're above that level, you're not in poverty. If you're below it, you are. Where does that income level come from? Long story. But the shocking thing is that even updated as of today's most recent numbers, the poverty level for a family of four in the United States is around $31,000. Okay, so where can you afford to live in the US as a family of four on an income of $31,000? The simple answer is nowhere. Okay, how do I know that? And the answer is I calculated. I looked at the outcomes for families all around the US at the family level. What do they have in terms of income and government supports? All in, what have they got? And then what does it actually cost to live basic necessities by county all around the United States? So I compare family by family, what they have to live on of their own earnings and what's given to them by a variety of government programs, and then what does it cost for housing and food and the transportation, only that necessary to get to work, and clothing and minimal health care. And the answer is that over one third of families in the United States do not have the all-in resources to pay for basic necessities. All right, so the poverty rate I just showed you on the previous slide, it's about 11% of the population, depends on which month you look. This is three times that. That's for everyone. If you break it down by racial and ethnic categories, half or more of Black and Hispanic families do not have adequate resources. And that has not improved recently, as the bottom part of the table shows, going from the middle column to the rightmost column. The percentages falling short in 2020 are a bit lower than those falling short in 2023 because the price of necessities in particular, and this is true for housing, but not only housing, went up. And some incomes improved, it's true, but not as much as those necessities prices rose. So there's the first two measures. Poverty rate, widespread, lots of people experience poverty, but that's really small compared to and what I think is a much better assessment of need, which again, these are my calculations or for the Brookings Institution. It's on the Brookings website if you want to go look at the details. Over a third of families don't have enough to pay for basic necessities. That is, to me, just a shocking failure of our economic system to develop basic needs to folks. And the third assessment, measurement of need that I want to look at, also widespread, is wealth. So many of you now have heard about the differences in wealth and how wealth is so unequally distributed across households in the US. That's absolutely true within any category. I'll show you a picture in a minute. The wealth distribution is very unevenly distributed. This little table is showing you by what are the differences between either the average or the median wealth for a black family, a Hispanic family, or other families, and a white family. So it shows you that the average black family has $1.2 million less wealth on average than a white-headed household. Hispanic is about the same. Some other racial categories a little bit less. The medians are smaller than that. We can worry about why later. But the point here is just the gaps are huge. Um, and so that's true. There's also significant overlap. And this is you're not used to looking at these sorts of charts. That's fine. But all the chart is saying is that the distribution of wealth is skewed way towards people who have zero or even negative net worth, because here and in the table, net worth is the difference between what you have in terms of assets, all of your savings, all of the any value that's in your house or your car and whatever, minus the amount of debt that you have that in many cases is used to pay for that. So you can actually have negative net worth, and some families do. But here, both black and white families are skewed towards low wealth, and there are a few families who have higher wealth, and that's the basic fact about wealth. And there's more statistics on this in the book. A tiny fraction of people hold 50% of all of the net worth in the economy. It's staggering. The bottom 50% of people in the US hold very little wealth at all, if they've got any. So wealth is very unequally distributed, period. And it's unequally distributed across race and ethnicity. And here I want to emphasize that when I talk about wealth, it's not because the goal in the US is to make everybody super wealthy. This is really about how much savings people have for very important and very straightforward economic needs, like if you have nothing in your savings and you suffer any kind of economic disruption, your boiler blows up, your car breaks down, you have significant repair expense, or you have a loss of hours and income in your job. There's no buffer there, and what's well documented is that when you have no buffer against those very ordinary economic vicissitudes, the path downward is rapid and severe. So you need it as a buffer, but of course you also need your savings as an acts as a road, an on ramp to prosperity through education, through housing, through entrepreneurship, and then later in life through stabilizing your retirement income and resources. So, well, this is not about making people wealthy. It's about the fact that wealth is necessary to gain access, to stabilize and to gain access to economic opportunity. And yet it is extremely unequally distributed in the US, and especially across race and ethnicity. So those three measures say need. What has the system generated? It has generated tremendous need across lots of folks. If you told most people that at least a third of our population or more really can't afford necessities, I think they'd be shocked to hear that. And it should be more of a headline and more of an indicator about how poorly our economy does at distributing opportunity and economic success. So meanwhile, as this chart shows, corporate profits as a percentage of GDP are still setting records, right? So all those people are just not doing well at all. And this goes back to 1947, which is when they started collecting reliable records on profits. As of the most recent data, we are still setting records for corporate profits. So earlier I said, remember that maxim, the narrative, the piece of the narrative, piece of the myth that relates to businesses said, do everything you can to maximize profits. Well, they have. There's no question about it. They are extremely profitable. And just to be clear, this is about large corporations generating profits. By and large, small businesses have a completely different story. They are often struggling. They're also often giving back to the community as a matter of course. So this is not about how small businesses work. This is about how large corporations do their business, and they have maximized profits pretty much at the expense of everything else. Because even while they're setting records, we have massive numbers of families, really just totally unacceptable percentage of our population struggling. And it certainly cannot be that more than one third of our population is struggling because they're lazy, right? That doesn't pass this vaguely pass the sniff test. It can't possibly be. Are there a few lazy poor people? Yep, there are. And there's a few lazy rich people and a few lazy middle income people. I think I put this in the book. A bumper sticker I'm putting together says that laziness is equally distributed across income deciles, right? Yes, there are lazy people everywhere, but that does not explain why those tens of millions of people are not doing well. Nor does the incredible wealth of the highest wealth owners nor is that explained by the fact that they're just so also incredibly brilliant and industrious that they deserve that wealth. And of course, that's where it should be, so disproportionately. That narrative is so corrosive. I'm not saying that hard work doesn't matter. It does. I told my kids growing up they should work hard. We should do that. We should encourage hard work. However, what's dismaying is that for so many working families, despite working so hard, they're not even close to making it. That's a structural failure, not a personal failure. We need to address the structure to make opportunity more available to everyone. Just quickly want to make a nod to the current shifts in political and cultural attitudes. Okay. So this is saying I just wanted to make at least a brief nod to current conditions on the political and cultural side. And this first chart is just showing that just recently, really in the last couple of years, the fraction of people who lean Republican, who believe that there's discrimination against blacks or Hispanics or Asians, has declined noticeably. It's interesting. That is not true for those folks who lean Democratic. So there is a political split there. That is a bit of a headwind in my view. And then secondly, this I'm sure you've read about, but this is just putting this is fascinating, making sure that folks that one, we had equal connection to folks outside of our building, making sure that we're connected to networks, that we make sure we had applicants from the best applicants from wherever, from whatever racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups we could find. That we found out that was not the case prior to making some efforts, and so we were losing access to good workforce members, but also within our own walls, we looked at our practices and policies to make sure that we really provided the same opportunities for advancement and promotion and pay and so on to everybody. And that was probably not quite true. Now that kind of implementation of DEI to me seems sensible. It's also not wholly, but in large part business focused. But that is not the way DEI has been portrayed in the media. They focus on some splinter or fabricated versions of DEI and say, well, we got to get rid of that. And it's like, well, I mean, if you're talking about the furries or whatever they were called, which never existed, sure, that would be a bad thing. It's just that it never existed. That's not what DEI is about. Anyway, these are headwinds. And for those reasons, I think, certainly for the moment, but maybe more generically, when we talk about what we should do to address the lack of opportunity, we should focus on things that are sort of big tent in nature, which is to say that if we in this environment, if we focus exclusively on racially, for example, racially targeted programs, while I am personally in favor of that, my guess is politically we will meet with less success. So let's think about things that are good for all of the folks in need who I showed on the previous charts. That includes some white families. That's, of course, part of our responsibility. But at the same time, then we'll disproportionately help out those who are disproportionately suffering. So these are some of the things I have in mind. Universal, high quality early childhood education. Why? Because it's been proven over and over and over again. This is really not a question anymore. This is not a trial. This is not a pilot program. We should be doing this always and everywhere. The benefits to investing in early childhood education have been shown to be just enormous. So to put it in dollars and cents, if you put a buck into early childhood education, it will return $7 to $10 over the child's first 25 years in terms of higher wages, better educational attainment, but therefore higher wages, better income, better healthcare outcomes, lower incidence of involvement with criminal justice. All of these, it's just, there's no question this is a terrific investment to make. And there are some states doing better at it than others, and some communities doing better at it. It should be a countrywide standard that every kid has access. There are others listed here, right? Pathways to stable employment, many of which would go through our community college systems because they are great connectors to lower income families and students. And they also have, in the best instances, connections to jobs that pay sustainable wages that just make a huge difference to those students during their lifetime. There are great examples of it, but it's not systematic enough. We need to seriously address whether wages paid in many occupations and locations are livable or not, as I suggested in the study that I did about the number of families in need. There are so many working families who are making wages that are simply not sustainable, even as many of their employers are making record profits. We need to address that dialectic. Um, and then we can consider expansions in the earned income tax credit, which would accomplish some of those things. And then there are, because wealth differences are so huge and take so long both to emerge and to redress, we need to think about things that would change the balance of wealth in the economy. So I've listed a couple there. Down payment assistance targeted to low income families will disproportionately help families of color and white families who don't have down payment. That's a wealth transfer. Baby bonds, which are deposits made in kids' accounts essentially at birth, with restricted uses, education, entrepreneurship, and so on, homeownership. Those are starting to be talked about more and more. That is a wealth redistribution. There's bunches of folks who have studied that. And the one I didn't put on the chart because it's more controversial is reparations, and I think we should talk about that in a minute. Okay, and so I'm pretty much done here, and then we'll have time for questions. So this is just saying, look, we constructed this. It is not the unavoidable outcome of choosing to have a capitalist-based economy. We constructed it so we can fix it. We should start by changing the narrative. We can talk about how to do that and whether it's possible. The Big Ten policies I just limited, and they're all listed, and they're all aimed at equalizing economic opportunity. Why? Because when you do that, we build human capital, education, skills, training, and so on, which will earn economic returns, and financial capital, wealth, and the returns to those investments are enormous. And importantly, they are not zero sum solutions. They're not solutions that only help some group at the expense of another. They're investments in opportunity that pay back and pay back everybody over time by growing the scale and scope of the economy. And those are investments we just have to make. So I want to close before the time for questions, which, as I say, is the most fun part, with a quote from Martin Luther King that you may not know. He has so many good quotes, but this one I think is particularly pertinent, which you can read. It must honestly admit that capitalism has often left a gulf between superfluous wealth and abject poverty, created conditions permitting necessities to be taken from the many to give luxuries to the few, and has encouraged small-hearted and mostly men, to become cold and conscienceless, so that, like dies before Lazarus, this is a biblical citation, they are unmoved by suffering, poverty-stricken humanity. Good description of where our economy works in, beautiful language, but also heart-rendering language. And it just says that's where we need to go. So the tagline for the book is this: we broke this. We did. We made decisions. We chose consistently to create an economy like this. But optimistically, we can fix it. How easy that is and how to do it is something we can talk about. I'm just
Wonderful.
going to take a drink of seltzer.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me see if I can figure out how to. Can you see me on the screen?
I
I
can
think
see you,
it's
yes.
okay, perfect. Well, I've hid myself, but that's probably better anyway, then I'm not distracted here.
Should
Um,
I take the slides down maybe? Is there anything else that
yeah,
it's to see instead? Yeah.
yeah, we can do that
Okay.
and always come back to things if there's
Sure.
something that kind of pulls us back toward that. Um, that was such a wonderful summary of this incredibly rich and dense and layered study that you present. And I think really interested to kind of hear as well if members of the audience have questions, but I have a sort of a number of questions to kind of get us started. And hopefully you'll kind of bear with me in some of this discussion.
For sure.
Um, one of the things I think what folks who are just joining us who haven't read the book, going through and hearing kind of your overview of the sort of premise of the book and the layers that you build into it. One piece that certainly is a component of the book that I think really humanizes the narratives is the inclusion of the kind of first person case studies that are interspersed. Can you talk a little bit about how and when you decided to include first person stories? And are there ones that weren't included that you want to share with us here today?
Sure. Um, so, my first inclination as an economist was data analysis, logic,
Hmm.
because to
Hmm.
me, of course, that's compelling. So when I
Hmm.
was starting to put the beginnings of this book together when I was at the Kennedy School, there were a couple of fellows, colleagues of mine, who said, if you can get to folks to talk to real people about this, boy, it will be more compelling. And in addition to that, two great friends. Well, one is my first cousin and his wife, who are, of course, also great friends, and we're hearing about this project and said, the book should be just stories.
Hmm.
Just tell the stories of people and just leave it at that. So I took on board both of those suggestions, although not fully for the latter,
Hmm.
because it's not possible for me to interview enough people to tell a story that I would feel confident was representative of the
Hmm.
experience of the 360 million people in our country.
Hmm.
But so I compile the data because I think the data is overwhelming. I put so much in there because I think, look, you can argue about any one of these things, but you can't argue about the totality of the picture.
Hmm.
Um, and most people don't groove on data and charts. They just don't.
Hmm.
What they
Hmm.
like to hear is storytelling. And frankly,
Hmm.
this is something I've been learning about. It is more compelling to hear people's stories as
Hmm.
long as they're backed up by the data and the careful historical research as well.
Hmm.
Um, that's where people start to connect.
Hmm.
Those are real people that interviewed. As I say in the book, for some of them, it was really painful to tell their story. So they're
Hmm.
so generous in
Hmm.
relating to me their experiences as participants in this broken, disjointed, somewhat mean-spirited, pull yourself up by your bootstraps economy. I
Hmm.
hope that that made a difference for people reading the book to see that, yeah, this is real life. And I didn't,
Hmm.
these are the people that I could get to through various
Hmm.
nonprofits who acted as a bridge.
Hmm.
There are more I could have talked to, and there are more I've talked to since, and there are more we're
Hmm.
talking to right now because
Hmm.
we're making a film that will be almost not exclusively, almost exclusively storytelling. So to
Hmm.
me, a really important part of the book, to many people I talk to,
Hmm.
very important. However, I would not leave it just to storytelling
Hmm.
because I just, I need the confidence that this is backed up by the data and the analysis.
Hmm. Yeah, it creates a really important marriage, I think, that hopefully, um, readers and people who are listening are able to kind of carry or follow along with if they pick up the book. We do have two really wonderful questions in the chat. One I know you and I were planning to talk about anyway, but I'm going to jump into the first one is maybe a little more straightforward. Elizabeth Kasdan is saying, I seem to remember from my long ago corporations law class that at least publicly held corporations are required to maximize profits, or else shareholders can sue the board of directors. Is this true? And is it a legal structure that needs to change?
Yep. So I don't know the
Hmm.
law because I'm not a legal scholar. I do know they
Hmm.
have a fiduciary responsibility to their
Hmm.
shareholders. That's right. But
Yeah.
let's be clear, what it means to quote maximize profits is
Hmm.
completely ambiguous,
Hmm.
right? Because you could say, well, I know how to maximize profits. I set costs to zero, and then
Mm.
whatever my revenues are,
Hmm.
they'll max. Well, cost to zero, two-thirds of the
Hmm.
cost for most businesses is labor costs. Well, for one thing, of course,
Hmm.
that doesn't work because the laborers are actually doing something.
Hmm.
But if you said that, then the right answer is I set wages as low as possible
Hmm.
and benefits and other costs of labor as low as possible.
Hmm.
That's a solution that might, allow you to quote maximize profits.
Hmm.
So look, what I'm saying is I don't know the, jot and tittle of the law for the
Hmm.
corporations. What I do know is this. Of course, corporations should be motivated by making profits and making good profits where they
Hmm.
can.
Hmm.
But if what you choose is this slavish devotion to
Hmm.
making profits as high as possible at all
Hmm.
cost,
Hmm.
the surest way to do that is to minimize your costs, and the disproportionate brunt is felt by the folks who work for you. And
Hmm.
that's not a winner, especially what
Hmm.
happens as shown in the data. It's not the C-suite folks who have been suffering in terms
Hmm.
of wages. It's people well below that who are
Hmm.
doing evidently important work for those
Hmm.
corporations, but are not making loads. So
Hmm.
to say nothing of the fact that in addition to your responsibility to your workers,
Hmm.
and the book talks about the history of the worker employer contract earlier in history. That has
Hmm.
definitely changed. Why
Yeah.
that is complicated, but it is
Hmm.
in part due to the power of these narratives. So
Hmm.
I'm all for them making profits. What I'm saying is I don't like the coexistence of profits,
Hmm.
enormous profits with
Yeah.
tremendous economic suffering. And no,
Hmm.
there's no legal obligation that you have to maximize profits at the expense of,
Hmm.
at the poverty of your
Yeah.
workers. That's not a
Yeah.
legal requirement. Should you be
Hmm.
responsible and try to make profit? Sure. But
Hmm.
there's a lot of space between that statement and what we see and the outcomes in the economy today.
Hmm.
And that's again to say nothing of other responsibilities corporations may have for the communities in which they operate,
Hmm.
for the
Hmm.
environment that they affect through their
Hmm.
activities, some of which will be, we hope, taken care of by environmental regulations. But there's pushback on
Hmm.
that now, and that's unfortunate because that's one of the most widely agreed upon roles for government among economists is that when actors in the course of delivering their products, their goods or their services to the economy, when they
Hmm.
have adverse impacts on the climate or on other
Hmm.
actors, which
Hmm.
they don't directly pay for, the government is the only organization that can step in to make sure that they internalize those effects that they have on the rest of the world. And when we
Hmm.
back away from that, we do so to the detriment of economic efficiency, but also to
Hmm.
the detriment of the climate, to our communities and other folks who are affected by economic activity.
Hmm.
So yes, good question. I don't know the legal
Yeah.
details, but I can tell you they do not constrain companies such that they have to impoverish their workers. Nowhere is that a legal requirement. Yes,
Hmm.
they have a fiduciary responsibility, but that takes it way too far.
Yeah, and that's I think a great way to underscore again one of the myths that perpetuates this idea that somehow there's a binary between businesses operating ethically and businesses increasing their profit.
Right.
Um, that those somehow can't coexist. Um, so, Joanne Morrison has asked the question, perhaps. I believe that the case for reparations for African Americans is often misunderstood. Can you speak to that a little, please? And I'm going to forbear upon you to read that quote that I sent you first, if I can, just to contextualize this within a local history story, which comes from Paul Cuffey. Um, so hopefully, as many on the Zoom know, in our museum we have an exhibition devoted to an extraordinary historical figure from the region, Paul Cuffey, who was an individual Afro-Indigenous, became one of the wealthiest Black men in the United States under the presidency of James Madison, and was extraordinarily successful here in the region, living in Westport, although at the time it was all part of this one big area. In 1780, not long after Massachusetts passes the state constitution, Cuffey and one of his brothers, Paul Cuffey, I should say, and one of his brothers, John, petitioned the state legislature um, uh, really asking that they be given the right to vote because they are property holders and they are being taxed. And under the Constitution, they feel that they are being unfairly treated. And initially, they bring sort of to the courts all of the taxes they've been paying. So, all of the evidence of the work and the kind of property ownership and the contributions they've been making to the community. And the court turns them down. And then in a second petition, they join with a number of other individuals in the area who are property holders, but much less wealthy. And they write to the court. It's an extraordinary petition, but I just want to read this one section. They say that we, being chiefly of the African extract, and by reason of long bondage and hard slavery, we have been deprived of enjoying the profits of our labor or the advantage of inheriting estates from our parents, as our neighbors, the white people, do, having some of us not long enjoyed our own freedom. And it carries forward, and they talk about the taxes they've been paying, the representation they've had. They've been reduced to a state of beggary, whereby we shall become a burden to others, if not timely prevented by the interposition of your justice and your power. And it's just this extraordinary document that I think maybe speaks to a lot of the kind of legacies and histories that undergird many of the myths that you address directly in the book. So if I thanks for bearing with us here, but I wanted to insert that little historical element here that is explored in one of our recently opened exhibitions as a foreground to think about what reparations mean and why they might be so important to generations of descendants of individuals who have not had the opportunity to grow wealth across family.
Well, what you just said is sits at the heart of the discussion, I think. It is generations of families who have not been given the same opportunity to accumulate wealth that not all, but many white families have. How did that happen? Well, first and foremost, of course, through slavery. But not only there, there are a host of other policies, programs, congressional and private sector actions that have been taken that deny opportunity and deny wealth building. That's documented in the book, but the book, of course, is citing the research of countless dozens who have researched this topic. Those institutional features of our country, starting with slavery but extending through the 20th century, it looks like we're having an internet connection problem again. Is that true?
You've caught up here. We're following along.
Okay.
Yep.
Take that as a premise. Those institutional features have denied opportunity systematically. We have, at the very least, a responsibility to discuss what we owe as a nation to those who have been denied the opportunity. And that's really what reparations is about, is what do we owe them financially? What do we owe them in terms of sort of truth and reconciliation? And I think at the very least, openly starting that discussion is critical. Have we ever done reparations before? We actually have. We gave reparations to Japanese citizens who were interned during the during World War II. We calculated wages lost. We paid settlements to families. Obviously, you may be aware that the nation of the Federated Republic of Germany paid reparations to Holocaust
Hmm.
survivors, where they calculated the
Hmm.
loss of income and wealth and property and so on.
Hmm.
There is precedent for it. But I think, so most importantly, if you recognize the institutional damage done, if you recognize that it happened over generations, and if you recognize that, as Martin Luther King said, at the very same time that we were propping up what he called white peasant farmers with all kinds of supports of finances and equipment and land and opportunity in the 20th century, we were asking black people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. You
Hmm.
see that contrast, or putting it differently. Someone asked me during one of my talks when the topic of reparations came up, they said, well, how could you design a significant government program that affords wealth building opportunities to one subset of the population? My answer was, we already did that.
Hmm.
We did it for not all, but a subset of white families through the GI Bill, through housing
Hmm.
assistance, through educational assistance, through all kind, I
Hmm.
mean, through the initial instantiations of unemployment insurance and so on
Hmm.
that cut out segments of the workforce, predominantly people of color,
Hmm.
so that they didn't get that economic stabilization. So the answer is we did that before. What we're
Hmm.
proposing is let's do it more equally to
Hmm.
all members of our society. Now, there are folks who have spent much more of their career studying this than I, who have estimated, and I estimated too, what is the size of reparations? Well, one estimate of the cumulative economic damage done is exactly those wealth gaps which I presented. Because when you try to
Mhm,
attribute those just to differences in income or education today, it doesn't square. Do those things
mhm,
make a difference? Yes, some over long spans of time. But
mhm,
equalizing income today for some black families who have the same income as white families does not equalize their wealth. It takes
mhm,
generations to do that. It took generations to build those disparities. So
mhm,
this is one way of doing it. There are many, looking at the wealth gap or any other way of assessing the damage. It's trillions of dollars that have been denied in terms of wealth accumulation for those families. Is that
mhm,
feasible today? Don't know. But one, you should be aware of the size of it, and two, you should start the discussion now that says we as a nation are responsible for our nation's historical policies to a subset of our individuals, and we need to figure out what we can do and what we should do to
mhm,
address that. That's the conversation we should have. I've heard people say it makes them uncomfortable, and it's like, good, you should be uncomfortable. And discomfort is
mhm,
a good place to start this
mhm,
discussion. And also, please weigh, if you're a white person who feels discomfort about this, please weigh your discomfort against the centuries of
mhm,
economic oppression that are the reason we need to have this discussion. I'll take your discomfort, but
mhm,
I'll put down against it the centuries of significant oppression and murder and deprivation and say, okay, that's a good beginning for the discussion.
mhm, mhm. Thank you for that.
Sure.
I think I'll kind of uh, ask a question in a question, which is this book about politics? And in this moment where these issues seem to be so politicized, what can we do about it? How can we move the conversation forward in this national climate? And do you have hope for that in the kind of moment that we're in today?
So this is the first question. Is this a political?
Mhm,
So when all of you get a chance to read the book, I know you all will. When,
mhm,
when you all get a chance to read the book, what you'll see is, or you can just take my word for it, it isn't really about politics. There are a
mhm,
few surveys that, like the one I presented today, that,
mhm,
as a matter of fact, do skew politically. That's true. But
mhm,
it's not the case that only Republicans have done damage or only Democrats have done damage, depending on which side of the
mhm,
aisle sit on. Not true. Both sides have done stuff that has not helped the potential forward progress of our economy. So I actually don't think this at its heart, is primarily about politics.
mhm,
It is primarily about economics, about history, about human behavior, and
mhm,
about the potential that is left on the table, economic and human potential both,
mhm,
because of the way our economy is structured.
mhm,
Does that then have political ramifications? Of course it does.
mhm,
But to the second part of the question, what should we do and how feasible is it? Okay, so look,
mhm,
you might say, oh, we're so divided politically now that you can't make anything happen.
mhm,
And I think if we continue to do things in the old-fashioned way, that's probably true, but I don't think that's the best way to go. I actually think the things that I've talked about in my book and that some other people are talking about now are about addressing economic need across political boundaries, across racial and ethnic boundaries, but not forgetting the racial and ethnic implications of our history. And if we were to pursue a program that provided opportunity more broadly,
mhm,
it will be of appeal to poor white Republicans, poor white Democrats, black and brown Democrats and Republicans, everybody, because for
mhm,
those suffering, it will start to actually provide opportunity and access and build economic fortunes over time, fortunes loosely construed over time. And when that happens, as I emphasized earlier, that's good for the overall size of the economic pie, which will be
mhm,
good for everybody. And to boot, the humanitarian implications, if we change the way we think about our country, if we
mhm,
change from thinking about ourselves as loosely allied state or smaller fiefdoms who are all competing for an ever shrinking economic pie that pits one of
Mhm.
us against the other, and
Mhm.
change our way of thinking to one that says this is a nation founded on the
Mhm.
prospect of opportunity. And if we pull together
Mhm.
and believe that, as Martin Luther King said, when one of us is not succeeding, all of us are not succeeding. If we
Mhm.
adopt that mentality, that bridges political parties. It certainly bridges socioeconomic, it bridges racial and ethnic divisions. And
Mhm.
if implemented, points to a future that's great for everybody. So I
Mhm.
think, there is a way of communicating this program, this future, this way of thinking about how broad our community should be construed that transcends politics. But
Mhm.
importantly, um, like the efforts I took to listen to people for the book, and I will be doing so for this film that we're making, listening is the first and most important step.
Mhm.
Why? Because we need to understand what people are struggling with, and
Mhm.
we need to rebuild trust with folks who
Mhm.
have good reasons not to trust politicians or economists or policymakers
Mhm.
anymore. We need to rebuild that trust to build a coalition that points in the right direction that will be of help to everybody, especially those who
Mhm.
are the neediest and have the least opportunity.
Mhm.
That's the way forward. I didn't say anything about Republicans or Democrats really in that
Mhm.
maybe overlong diatribe. Do we need to address some of it? Of course we do, right? I
Mhm.
mean, I'm not
Mhm.
ignorant, but I
Mhm.
think grassroots listening, rebuilding of trust, focusing on opportunity building, long-term investments in people's economic and human potential, those are dead winners.
Mhm.
They pay off for sure. They appeal to a broad swath of our citizens.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that is the way forward.
Mhm.
Whichever party chooses to adopt that, I'm voting for
Mhm.
them. But I have my suspicions, but it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
That was not a political argument. That's a
Mhm.
humanitarian argument.
Yeah. And that's a great one. I think hopefully we can all take that one to heart. And I think particularly in this economic moment, thinking about how to combat this kind of overwhelming narrative of competition and scarcity that seems to kind of pit people against each other rather than coming together is such an important thing to think
Right.
about, even if you're, seeing it play out in very small ways in the community you're within.
Yeah, and just to talk
Hmm.
for a moment about scarcity,
Hmm.
um, a couple of things I've said today and more of the things I say in the book are
Hmm.
demonstrating that in the country as a whole, there is no
Hmm.
scarcity.
Hmm.
There's abundance, as
Hmm.
one of our famous authors has said recently. There is abundance in the economy between the profits that corporations are making, 40% of which in the last several years have been used to repurchase shares, not to go to productive investments or anything else. They're going back to
Hmm.
the shareholders essentially
Hmm.
again and again.
Hmm.
40%, so over $1 trillion per year for share repurchases. So there's one just indication of the excess abundance we have. And
Hmm.
taxes unpaid in the US annually are in the order of $700 billion, due,
Hmm.
legally liable, but are
Hmm.
never get paid.
Yeah.
So that's $2 trillion of stuff that, loosely speaking, is economic gravy.
Hmm.
Just that, and $2 trillion annually could do so much to invest in. So, for
Hmm.
example, early childhood education for
Hmm.
universal education for every kid born in the U.S. now going forward.
Hmm.
Not for folks who are wealthy and can afford to pay for it, but for those somewhere in the middle income distribution and below. I have some calculations of the book. Would cost 250
Hmm.
billion bucks a year.
Hmm.
Okay, that's a fraction of that's 1/8 of the
Yeah.
$2 trillion I just cited. Great, let's put
Hmm.
that one in place and use some of the money. Now, obviously,
Hmm.
it's easier to say than to do to get your hands on that $2
Hmm.
trillion, and yet
Yeah.
it's there. So
Hmm.
we have abundance. We are not an economy of scarcity.
Hmm.
It's how we distribute it, how we invest from those proceeds that we
Hmm.
need to think about.
Yeah. Thank you. I guess can we end with just one question for you, which is you mentioned the documentary. I'd love to hear from you what's coming next, particularly for people who are joining us. Can you share what that's going to look like and maybe how people can access it if you know?
So I don't know yet which channels it's going to be on. I mean,
Hmm.
we're in the business of making it right now. We now have six
Hmm.
and a half minutes of film that
Hmm.
is. predominantly interviews with residents where they just tell their life stories. There's a few talking
Hmm.
heads who will help to provide the
Hmm.
structure of the discussion. But
Hmm.
honestly, you just have to let folks talk about their lives and they tell the stories that are powerful and they tell the stories of how the economy does and does not work and why. So
Hmm.
that's what we're in the business of doing. We actually need some more funding for it. So I'm going to be working
Hmm.
on, we're supposed to hear from the Ford Foundation by tomorrow, whether we get the grant that will let us finish the film. Yeah, but
Okay.
I have no idea.
Hmm.
If not, we will talk to some other folks, and I think we'll
Hmm.
get the film done, but it has more filming to do.
Hmm.
It will come out later this year with any luck,
Hmm.
and it will tell the story of people who are working hard but don't have the opportunity to succeed, and then say, briefly, how do we move forward with that, but in a way that's much more accessible than the book, which has numbers and facts and figures and history.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I don't. Really interesting question actually is which
Hmm.
channels to get it out on so that it can be seen not just by the existing coalition of the willing,
Hmm.
but by
Hmm.
folks who might be open-minded, but maybe don't quite believe this stuff, are willing to
Yeah.
listen.
Hmm.
So we'll be working on that as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Um, well, we're right here at the top of the hour. I will just say again, Jeff, thank you for joining us and talking about your book. I hope people who've joined us purchase, read The Myth That Made Us, How False Beliefs About Racism and Meritocracy Broke Our Economy and How to Fix It. This has been a wonderful overview of the text and a really a pleasure to be able to talk to you a little bit more about some of the ideas in the book. Um, for those of us joining, again, this is the first of a new series that the museum is launching of book talks with authors about recent publications. I do hope you will pin in your calendars March 26th, the last Thursday of next month, where we will be joined by Eric J. Dolan, who will be talking about his nonfiction book on the history of privateering during the American Revolution. And with that, I will thank everyone for joining, and thanks especially to you, Jeff, for spending time with us
Thank
and
you.
talking about this study. It's
Thanks. It was a pleasure. Thanks
really
so much for the
wonderful.
questions too.
Oh, absolutely. So take care, and I hope everyone,
Keep
I hope
shoveling.
you, yeah,
Keep
I hope you
shoveling.
and everyone else exactly has an okay job digging out, and we'll see you again soon.
All
All
right,
right,
great. Thank you,
take
Naomi.
care.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.